It's hard not to feel cheated when somebody passes suddenly and you weren't expecting any of it. But it's even harder when you find out that with the honor that I have of being invited to speak here today for George, that to realize that I'm probably the only male that didn't get the kiss on the lips, and I now feel our relationship was not consummated. So it's, I landed a gig in New York City it was the late 90s, and it was the reverse of a famous, to me, it was the reverse of a popular BBC export to the United States called Upstairs, Downstairs, where the royalty lived upstairs and the help and the whole, many of you might remember it. We were the band playing upstairs. And downstairs, because jazz favors basements in many cases in New York City, was where the headliners played. Many of these, not all, but many of these headliners wouldn't bid the time of day to the band playing upstairs. They might have been worried about what they had to deal with, or maybe they just weren't interested. But I believe it was Rebecca Paris that George was there playing with at this newly opened club called the Jazz Standard. And on his first break, he was upstairs, and he told me that he played Hammond organ, and if I wanted to try doing something with the Hammond, he would love to do it. There's an unfortunate complexity to this story, and it was owned by, the Jazz Standard was owned by a drummer who loved music, and he entrusted the running of particularly the upstairs part of the operation to somebody who was very respected in the wine field, but really saw music as a big distraction to what his concept was. So I got away with it playing solo guitar for a brief period of time, and it's probably the first time I experienced this where the music was beginning to draw people in, but there was only so much. You can't hit the heavy bag for 4 hours every night. And I needed other musicians, and here was George at the right time. But unfortunately with this particular general manager, every time we got into a groove, even though we were playing at constant redefinitions of pianissimo, we were playing as soft as it could go, the guy didn't want it. So what happens, as happens in New York lore, George and I lost contact with one another, and not before I had experienced those rich harmonic voicings that he played, particularly behind ballads. Now you have to understand, he's playing with me on organ, so I'm not getting all the wonderful touch sensitivity that he displayed on the piano. I'm getting it on the Hammond organ. And I remember at the time thinking, this really feels a really special hookup musically that's going on. And I'm from Ireland, as many of you probably have figured out by now. I remember thinking, now is this just New York that, I came from Dublin where there were maybe 3 or 4 guys, and if you connected with one of those, that was your musical connection. Is it just that I'm in New York? Well, I had the good fortune to play with some of my idols and some of my legends, and I'm going to put it in perspective for you. I played with Tommy Flanagan, who was Ella Fitzgerald's accompanist for many years. The level of accompaniment that I've experienced from a pianist, from my perspective playing, has only hit that point twice. Tommy was one and George was the other. I told George recently that after one of the gigs at the Marion when we reconnected, he was calling next day, and he was probably the only guy who could come close to out-talking me, although I still think I had the edge. It's in our blood, so what can I say? But I told him that it was the first time I realized that playing the guitar, that it was a wind instrument. I felt myself breathing as we played. So George, as many of you know, was very modest about his own musical role, such as an accompanist is of that level. I got him one night when he dropped his guard, and we, with the help of maybe some tequila, we were talking about instrumentation and orchestration, and George said, and I quote, "I play all the instruments I write for," pause. "Well, except the trombone, but I'm taking lessons in that right now." So, as I said, we lost contact for a while, and he came back maybe a year later with Rebecca Paris. And I remember as I saw him, I had this kind of feeling that I had not done the right thing, even though it was out of my hands. I knew then that the hookup we had musically was something very special. And in my head, I was very embarrassed when I saw him. George told me years later, he said once or twice he wondered how come we didn't stay in touch. But he knew this kind of thing happened. But all the negativity that I was worried about was all in my head. It was not in his. So we now cut to a few years when we've probably more or less forgotten about one another. And Jeremy Pelt, who's gone on to make quite a name for himself on trumpet, was a huge Shirley Horn fan and told me he was going to see Shirley Horn perform, but with a kind of a down look in his face, but she's not going to be playing piano. And I immediately was curious. I know the history with Shirley Horn, that she recorded with Hank Jones and one of the finest pianists in this idiom, but Hank wasn't in her head. She, as a pianist, knew where she wanted to go musically. And my curiosity was, oh my God, who's in that seat? Who is going to be playing that chair? And then Jeremy, who had not met George, said to me, he mispronounced his name. He said, I think some guy called George Mesterhazy. And I went, oh, it's taken care of. You know, I said, this is going to be something else. And if you're talking to him, please say hello. Out of contact again. Now, Jeremy told me that he really loved what George did. George was very proud that Ahmad Jamal came up to him and said, you did your homework. That's how to play behind Shirley Horn. He wore that like a badge. So while this parallel is going on, George is driving back on one of his journeys from either to or from Cape May to New York, and he heard Jeremy Pelt's ballad album, in which Jeremy had asked me to write the string arrangements for. And he pulled over the car to hear the announcement who it was, so he wouldn't miss it. And when he heard my name mentioned, he told me how happy, the same as I was. I punched the air, by the way, when I heard he was playing for Shirley Horn. I went, good things happening to good people. He did the same thing when he heard that I was doing, as he said, that kind of quality work. He then followed it with a question. He said, I wonder, is he still in New York or did he move back to Ireland? And so our story goes until I see his name on Facebook, on Jeremy Pelt's page, and I shot him an email. And I had moved to what's known, I guess, in our area as the Jersey Shore, and I saw he was listed as South Jersey, and I'm thinking, there's no way this guy is living a town over from here, and I didn't know it. So I shoot him on Facebook. I said, where are you? I'm in the Jersey Shore. He shoots back his own reply, in which he said, you're one of my favorite musos, call me. I called him on the phone. He was about to go to play at a funeral of some of you would know in Cape May, he was Irish or had Irish connections, and he was going to play Danny Boy that day at the funeral. I told George I hadn't played the guitar in a number of years. I put the guitar down to stay home with two young boys, and he just glossed over that. And he said, hey, we do this jazz night at the Marion. I haven't played in a few years, with the exception of maybe one that I was shamed into. And so I've got a few days to get ready. I said, George, I'm not kidding you, I haven't been playing. He said, just come on down. And I took up the guitar a few times just so I wouldn't suffer the kind of shock that you get when you open the case after not touching it for a while. And I'm sitting there having dinner while his trio are playing, and they're on a roll. They sound like they're swinging hard like the Oscar Peterson trio. And I'm thinking, am I going to be able to step on this train? And when I get up, he calls my shining hour, and it's da 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 da, and I'm going, oh. So I got through it. Now, during this is all happening in the first week that we reconnect. George told me, I don't mean to say this by way, it sounds like a correction, this may have occurred after Johnny Mandel, who was a huge favorite, whose favorite arranger was Robert Farnon. George is one of the few musicians I had met who knew who Robert Farnon was. He adored him. 2 years earlier, I had actually gotten the courage up to call Robert Farnon and ended up striking up a relationship that was in many ways the envy of many arrangers. I would get a phone call from Farnon and he would say, David, Bob Farnon here, any music questions? And I'd go. So George said in that phone call, if I could see, the stuff that we could never get off the recordings, if I could just see this stuff written down. Now, I realize as somebody who received a lot from George, as everybody did with gifts, I seem to have a proud privilege that I can tell you through no planning or nothing else on my part, I got to give him on that level without even realizing it, because I told him, George, I don't have to tell you this, but I'm supposed to keep these very restricted and not share them, but I have over probably about 150 of Robert Farnon's scores. And there's silence on the phone, then I started talking about Nelson Riddle and the amount of scores I had by him. I had been collecting them, and we start to trade back and forth with other guys who are, don't tell them I gave you this, and before you know it. So I think it was a Tuesday night, because I know the way they went Tuesday and Thursday at the Marion. I brought my laptop, I brought some hard copy scores down and spare hard drive. While we're playing the gig, George is copying these scores. I told him, please take them. It was sometime afterwards, by which stage he's now given me 2 guitars. He's upset at what I'm using to listen to music, so he arrives with a pair of Genelec monitors, and he's set them up in the house, and I'm now listening, and I'm gone down that road now. There's no turning back. He called me and he said, I just wanted to say this part to all of you, actually, because he gave so much to us. He broke down on the phone. He said, you gave me these for no other reason other than you knew I loved them. And I'm sorry. It kind of turned me back to years earlier. I'd heard a quote from Oscar Wilde, and I don't normally take on the intelligentsia and on something like this, but I took issue with his quote where he said that a charitable act was an unselfish act carried out for selfish reasons. And I remember, for years I tried to process this in myself, and I realized, well, it makes you feel good when you give, and maybe you want to feel. And then I came around and I started to think that, well, it doesn't matter why. You just did it, and somebody benefited from it. Well, I have to tell you from my experiences, it didn't go. George didn't even think like that. With George, it wasn't to make him feel good. If he saw you, and a certain guitar was going to take you to that next level that he knew that you could go to, and it might have been a guitar that he dreamt about owning himself, he lost complete interest in that instrument right there and then and handed it over to you, and then spent the rest of his life enjoying the fruits to see what you could deliver. And this is something I gather all his... From a musician standpoint, I just want to speak, and I'm trying not to be long-winded, but it's against my DNA. Out of the blue, I got called to write a jingle for a medication. Now, I didn't know what it was. I'd never been, and I had to deal with ad agencies, and I'm on conference calls. I think it's the first time I've ever been on a conference call. And I hired George to... I wrote some music down just so I'd have something on paper when I walked in, because they wanted, in the clip, there were musicians jamming, talking about how it was a very confusing commercial, because it appeared to say, it appeared to go like this, my life really improved and was saved when I took this, but don't stop taking your other. It seemed... And on the morning of the session, George had stayed over in my house to help me. We had it was a run of about 2 days. It was also the debut of a big band that we played in together, that George would drive from Cape May. The gig paid $25, and the minute he put gas in the tank, he was at a loss. If I can interrupt my own tangent. I do remember how he would drive me and I'd say, if you drive my minivan, I'll catch a nap, because I had, as I say, young children, and I was seriously sleep deprived, and so he would drive. But on the way home, I'm thinking, what great company George Mesterhazy is. We're barely out of the Holland Tunnel, and I see his brother-in-law. I saw him sleep the whole way, wake up and say, the French horns and this are amazing. And I couldn't get to even have a riposte with him. Well, there was just something about that particular day that we did this recording for the jingle. We do the first take, and it's supposed to, there are people jamming in a New York loft or in the clip, and we've got to play music that's going to go with this. So George and the rhythm section are hitting it hard, and I can see the odd agency. And they're doing that director's thing a little less maybe. And so now that I'm very grateful for the first two speakers for lowering the linguistic moral bar so much that I could actually tell this story. George, I think one had a kind of a minor blues type of feel, and I walked out to him and I said, now this is the equivalent of walking out to an actor without telling him anything in advance and say, I want you to take John Wayne and mix him with Brad Pitt and have a clear idea of what it is you're looking for. I said to George something like, I want George sharing blocks, but with a kind of Ramsey Lewis type feel, that kind of funky thing. And my last words to him were, and this is what kind of nailed it, don't get into it like we're in a club. This has to be safe jazz. Play jazz with condoms on. If you heard every time I gave a direction like that involved a different player, and this speaks to his ability as a musician, it could be Oscar Peterson, it could be Bill Evans, anything you said, he would go. He would show this later on for the Jazz Standard Youth Orchestra when I introduced him. Said, George, would you just do your thing for a minute? Maybe just play a blues for them on solo piano. He took these kids through a history of jazz, from stride and, Bill Evans type playing. Back to the jingle. When we're booking this session, they say we have a Steinway upstairs, we have the Yamaha downstairs, and it's in Clinton Studios, so it's a pretty famous studio. Both pianos are going to be pretty good. So I'm thinking, are we going to have to pay any money to move the Steinway down? Well, it's going to cost a move, and it's okay. I didn't even consult with George. We'll take the Yamaha. And I'm figuring it's for a medication company, who, by the way, on the morning of the session, I'm stopped in the hallway, and somebody said, did you read the news today? The company who produced this medication were just fined $512 million by the American government. So I have one of those. Okay. And the ad agency, it's okay, we have the money, but, okay. So George plays the Yamaha piano. He plays a nice Steinway in the Marion Inn. Afterwards, we find out the studio's closing down, and the Steinway that I declined to bring downstairs is the Steinway that Kind of Blue was recorded on, and that Glenn Gould recorded the second Goldberg Variations. And I said, oh my God, I hope George doesn't hear about this. So he did, I told him, and he goes, you know what his response was? Man, that Yamaha was nice though. He was. So I'm going to leave you with a story that Tim Lecken called me to play. I think we can tell the circumstances now. Joe Mancini was being honored by the Summers Point Jazz Society. And so when Tim called me and said, now first of all, I'm on the committee, you can't book me to play bass because it's going to be a conflict of interest. Okay, well, I get a bass player. And he said, now this is the other one that's more difficult. You can't book George either because they've no piano in the place. And I'm about to say, well, George will play a Hammond, or he'll play a Fender Rhodes, which he did beautifully. And he goes, no, here's the thing. Joe does not like to play on a keyboard. He just likes to play on piano. And he's worried that if George brings an electric piano there, he's going to be forced into playing. And, in fairness again to Joe, in this circumstance, not everybody can do their thing on an electric keyboard. If you're a piano player, that's what again made George exceptional. That no instrument seemed to stand in the way of him being able to make music on it. So I'm thinking, how am I going to? I can't go down and play in that neck of the woods with for all these people. And I think, well, before I go and complicate things, maybe George is still out on the West Coast playing with Paula West. No, he's back in town at that stage. And I called Tim. I said, how are we going to do this, Tim? I don't... And he goes, well, George, there is the other thing. You know, he plays a lot for here, and maybe he was worried maybe there might be some accusation of overexposure. So finally, I did what the best thing was to do. I said to George, you know, told him the whole story. He goes, I'll bring my guitar. And in true George Mesterhazy fashion, he brought this nylon string guitar that looked like a stick that had, it was designed to not feed back. And it had this big frame on the body. And it sounded great. It didn't feed back at all. And at the end of the gig, I said, that guitar sounds great. He said, you're going home with it. You know. Now, from a simple statement, and this is what's going to get me off the stage, I decided to write something for the big band that was in a completely different style to the more swinging kind of stuff or more traditional. And this was at a time when George was listening a lot to Vince Mendoza recently, and a lot of those kind of harmonies that, loosely speaking, I would say come out of Aaron Copland. And I wanted to write something with that kind of feeling of Americana too. And I wrote this tune, and in fact I still have the text on my phone from when Paul Jost rehearsed it. It was written to feature Paul Jost, and it was, I was trying to capture musically the image of the rolling hills of Pennsylvania when my wife was from Harrisburg, and we used to go back and forth from there, and I'd see these hills, and so it was all rolling into one for me. And George loved that tune so much that this is how his encouragement to me to compose. He said, hey man, unless it's a commission or unless it's for a vocalist, stop writing arrangements of other people's music. Just do your own shit from now on. So, you all have to know, who've worked with him, coming from George, what that meant to any musician, because I held him in the highest esteem. He used to actually say to me, in sadder terms, he said, I hope I'm able, he seemed to think I was overrating him. Is it possible? I mean, really, is it possible? And I'm going to just close out with John O'Hara, writer from Pennsylvania, wrote when George Gershwin died. He said, George Gershwin died on July 11, 1937, but I don't have to believe it if I don't want to. Well, finish it for yourselves.
I'm going to keep this short mainly because I don't think I'm emotionally capable of talking very long about somebody who I love very, very much. But I met George 27 years ago, and George came into my store to select a Steinway that day for Babes. I had no idea the day that I met him how important he'd become in my life. But I did have some idea how kooky he was because he played Old MacDonald Had a Farm. And over the 27 years that I've been involved with some of the finest artists in the world, both jazz and classical artists, no one ever played Old MacDonald Had a Farm or anything close to it. So I should have known. As time went on over those 27 years, to my surprise, I had been away from playing for a whole lot of years. I decided I lost one of my sons to cancer, and I visited 2 other music teachers, thinking that maybe if I got back involved in music and studying music again, that would allow me to deal with the loss of my son. Both of the first 2 people I found weren't capable of doing that. When I was with George about 20 minutes, I knew that I'd have a long time studying with George and many, many years of friendship. I found George to be very very genuine. I look for that in people because I think a lot of people aren't genuine. George was a very genuine, caring individual, and he knew that my problem was not with the ability to learn music, but it had to do with the state that I was in at that particular time. following my son, and throughout my lifetime, I've had 13 bouts of cancer myself. And I've credited George with doing more than even medicine did for me, or the skilled doctors that operated on me so many times. George gave me the will to live. And the will to live was so I could spend more time with him. So many of you have talked today about all the wonderful characteristics of George. The one that stands out foremost in my mind was that he had a way of making you feel more important when he was with you than anything else was in life. And he elevated you to a state that you really weren't at. Recently, I played with him at a Christmas party, and he called me 3 days in a row to say he was shocked at how well I grew musically and how he'd love to play with me every day of his life. Because my life has been so fragile, George also was a person who had a way of anticipating everything that I did musically. And I think this time he also beat me to the punch. I had a plan to get with him and talk to him about what he would do at my celebration service, because I never dreamed that I'd be at his. I was certain he'd be at mine. And I can't help thinking that I wish I could tell him how pissed off I am about that. You know, so. Somewhere he knows it. And someday I'll see him again. And when I do, I'm going to tell him how pissed off I was about that. The other thing I didn't like about George, I heard somebody mention the kisses before. He was the sloppiest kisser I ever met. No question about it. And he wouldn't let you get away from his kisses. That was impossible. I would try to turn side to side, whatever. I ducked a couple times, which wasn't hard for me to do because he was taller, but he found some way to get down to my level and just throw one more on me. So, but anyway. Also, it's just something that I discovered not too long ago. Usually when I'm on a stage, I'm rarely on a stage without my wife, and we're often involved in getting awards for being involved in goodwill towards children, young children learning music, and people that don't have the resources to be able to pay for lessons and things like that, and the support of music teachers. And usually when we're on stage, I say that my wife does all the talking. I just write the checks. So this is an unusual spot for me to be. But I decided not too far back that I would sometime say what happened to me as a result of George. And I'll tell you what it is now. And a day without music is a day without any real meaning. George taught me that. A day without George in my musical life is unimaginable to me at this point, because I took him so much for granted. I didn't like when he called me sometime at 4 o'clock in the morning when he was moved to do it, but it's just unimaginable to me. I'm personally devastated by the loss of George, and there's just no way that I feel that to use that tune, I don't know how I can keep our music playing without George there to guide me. He called me his musical soulmate. He was my musical soulmate. George, I love you very much. And thanks for all that you did for me musically. But I wish you could learn a tune other than Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Thank you very much.
Part of me wishes that George knew he was dying so that he could have videotaped his own eulogy. We would have all been laughing hysterically and sobbing uncontrollably at the same time. When I pulled into the parking lot this morning, I got out of my car and a gentleman next to me said to me, George meant so much to me in my life, but I really feel especially for you. And I said, not especially anybody, especially everybody in this room, and so many people who aren't here. When I was 15 years old, I was introduced to George. He took me under his wing, and he never let go. Can you imagine decades of someone believing in you more than you believe in yourself, teaching you, loving you for decades, consistently for decades? But you can because you're here. Because the planet George Mesterhazy, or the universe George Mesterhazy, it was so expansive, is so expansive that my story is just a subtle variant of your story. It's all the same story. Not especially anyone, especially everyone. That's all.
Our words fail us. Death has surprised us, and it's shocked us, and it's left us asking why and why now, and it's as if the sun had set in broad daylight. We miss him. We miss George so, and we stumble under the burden of our feelings of sorrow and loss and confusion and numbness. And oh God, we know that it's because we love George so much. The more we loved him, the more we sorrow today. But you are a compassionate God, and we thank you that you know what we are feeling. You knew before we did that to love is to risk a goodbye. And it was out of nothing but your deep, deep love for us that you risked sending Jesus to us, that you loved us enough to open the way from despair to hope, from brokenness to wholeness, from death to life. You are the holiest of all of our friends, O God. And George's birthday, yes, it did fall on Easter this year. And in the Christian story, the story that George learned how to play the pipe organ in about 2 minutes 4 at the First Presbyterian Church, in the Christian story, Easter means that you have trampled down death by death. You have said goodbye to death. You have said goodbye to that final boundary of human life. Goodbye to that door we are afraid to approach. Goodbye to that threshold over which George has already passed. Your Easter story, George's new birthday story, tells us that you have swallowed up the goodbye of his death. You have stripped that goodbye of all its power, and you have replaced it with a hello of your own. It's a paradox, this Easter birthday story, oh God, that your goodbye to goodbye means Easter is really your hello to each one of us. And so when the weight of our grief flattens us, and the if-onlys and the buts and the shoulds and the shouldn'ts all shout goodbye, 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 it's your Easter birthday story, those notes just echoing just over the dawning that say hello. And when the dreams that we cherished for George dry up and drift off into memory as shadows of yearning and our regret for the things that we wish we had said to him, when all of that says goodbye, your Easter birthday story answers with hello. And we go to the grave with our dearest, dearest George, and we cannot imagine how we will find the strength to live another day. And the sorrow says over and over again, goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. But you say hello, 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 hello. Seal that promise to us, oh God. Seal that promise to us that George has, as he wished for all of us, that he has touched your face. He has heard that sound that we hear oh so faintly. He has heard it loud and beautifully, big. Hello. Drench us with hello. Drench us with the hope that you will bring us, all of us, to where George now is, to that home beyond our experience, to that life that is just beyond our awareness, to that music that will never, ever die. Give us dreams of the dawn. Dreams that you alone can breathe into our tomorrows now. Dreams where we see that we have all along been carried in your arms and held in your unconditional love and blessed by your promise that nothing that happens to us, nothing we say, nothing we think, nothing we do, nothing can keep us from your dawn. The dawn of that eternal morning where we will be, as George now is, lost in wonder, greeted by the music of your voice that includes the sound of George's voice, the sound of George's music, saying forever and a day, hello. We thank you and praise you for George's hello. Amen.
I always thought that George would be playing that for me.
Into your hands, O merciful Savior, we commend your servant, George Mesterhazy. Acknowledge, we pray, a sheep of your own fold, a lamb of your own flock, a sinner of your own redeeming. Receive him into the arms of your mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the glorious company of the saints in light.
And may God raise you up on eagle's wings, bear you on the breath of dawn, make you to shine like the sun, and hold you in the palm of his hand. Amen.